Eric is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. His life began in Lambeth, London in 1925, and in previous episodes we discovered the extreme poverty that he grew up in, and we then heard of the tragedy as he was separated from his family as a very small boy. He and his younger brother Lionel were shipped off to a boys' home where he and others suffered greatly. He then was able to go and work on a farm, and life was much improved. In the last episode, Eric described that farm life really wasn't for him, and he also mentions briefly the bombings of Exeter, which were taking place because of World War II. As the chapter closed, he describes gathering a few things from the farmhouse, and secretly, in the middle of one night, he ran off into the darkness to start his life all over again. I had found my way to Taunton, but with no food left, I was now out on a limb and had to consider my future. Failure to do so would mean my return to the home. I was now 16 years old and needed a career. The only place locally was the GWR, or the Great Western Railway, at Taunton in Somerset. They took in youngsters, so I went to see the superintendent and was taken on as a boy cleaner. The job entailed cleaning the outside of the huge beasts, the railway engines. Obviously, I had never seen anything as big as this before, and was completely overawed at such a monstrous task. There were several lads on this duty, and we soon formed quite a team. But first of all, I had to be initiated into the group, and that was quite an experience. One day, I went to work as usual, and strangely enough, seemed to be on my own. That situation soon changed. The lads all appeared from nowhere and pounced on me. They stripped me of all my clothes, and then daubed me with engine oil and grease. That was my initiation, and I accepted it. I was not a crybaby, and I didn't tell tales of who did it. That was part of the home discipline. So I was accepted by the lads as one of them, and my career had started. The others were older than me and more experienced, so they were able to offer help when I fell behind in my work. They also offered me friendly advice on how to please the foreman and increase my chances of being placed with a driver to start learning how to fire the engines. My dreams were soon realized, and one day I found myself on a small engine in the goods yard. The drivers we were eventually placed with were instructors who held very strict rules and set very high standards for us to achieve. I was able to knuckle down to this kind of discipline and treated these men with the respect they deserved. Again, more home discipline. After a year of this very hard instruction, I eventually was passed as a fireman. I had to learn the work and also the company rulebook. When I and my instructor and superintendent thought I was confident, I had to attend a classroom exam in Swindon, and I made it. I was now a passed fireman and was able to fire engines on small goods trains and local branch line passenger chains. Life was good now. I had met a lot of very pleasant people who had accepted me for what I had achieved. I had wonderful lodgings with a family who were registered with the GWR for lodging. I felt I was on my way. During this time, we had been at war with Germany for 2 years, and there was always a threat of bombing raids. Exeter had been badly hit, and Taunton wasn't that far away. Because of this, we employees were enlisted as part-time air raid wardens, and as in my case, firefighters. Fortunately, we were never needed for that, but once again there were rules, regulations, and strict training to be learned. This I absorbed quite easily thanks to my home training. The year was 1942. Unbeknownst to anyone, the War Office had decided that Newbury was the ideal area to form a huge depot for all that would be necessary for the invasion of France. This also meant that transportation would be a vital part of the operation, so Newbury was developed into a railway control depot. All they needed were engine crews and guards to manage these trains that were vital as part of the war campaign. These men were selected from engine depots from all over the GWR region: London, Oxfordshire, Wiltshire, Devon, Cornwall, and South Wales. I was among those chosen, and that's how I became posted to Newbury. First, I should explain what was meant by a control depot. If you can imagine it, Newbury was the centre of a vast railway network, much like a spider's web. All traffic from all over Britain that was destined for the southern and western ports had to come through Newbury. Therefore, because of the distance the trains had travelled, the crew members needed relieving. And that's where we came in. Each crew consisted of 3 men, a driver, a fireman, and a guard. We were known as a set. There were 24 sets at Newbury, 21 of which were on duty to relieve these trains. This virtually meant we were on shift duty all around the clock. The other 3 sets were on shift duty covering AM and PM and nights in the Marshall yards. It didn't matter what hour we signed on. We would phone Reading, the centre of operations, and they would tell us what time our train would arrive, where it was from, and where we were going to next, bearing in mind that this was wartime and everything was kept very discreet and we didn't discuss our trip with anyone. We never knew what we were carrying unless it was necessary for us to know because of enemy action or axle box fires, which was a frequent occurrence. We all reported on duty to a cabin situated near the railway station. It was a very austere building containing wooden benches and a table. There was a wash basin, a gas ring, and coat hooks for hanging our coats or raincoats. On the wall was a duty roster listing the starting times of all sets. This had to be very strictly observed as the hour of our starting time could be altered at any time. To be late or miss a duty was considered to be a very serious offence, almost treasonable. No excuses were accepted. On many occasions, as one would book on duty, we signed a register, other crews would be in the cabin, either because their train had not arrived or because they were foreign crews from other depots who were waiting to get home. That's when the fun and games would start. The general discussion would be about previous train journeys and what had taken place in that time. One such occasion that raised a few laughs was when a train had pulled into a siding until the line ahead was clear. The fireman decided that it was an opportune time to go to the loo. It was only when he was standing between 2 wagons that he realized the train was moving, and he bolted out and ran toward the engine, trying to do his buttons up at the same time. I became the subject of another joke when we were in a siding with another train. Our engine wasn't doing very well, and my driver sent me across to the other engine to ask that driver if he could transfer some steam. I fell for this hook, line, and sinker. There were many occasions for such banter, and we had to be on our toes in case such a trick was played again. It was this kind of humour that kept us going during these very hard times. We never knew what we were in for on each turn of duty. Sometimes there was fatigue, and sometimes relationships were strained. This became very apparent if things were not going right. The engine could be an absolute pig to work, and no matter how hard the fireman worked, he just could not keep up an efficient working steam pressure, ideally 250 pounds per square inch. Unless this was maintained, the engine would not pull and would eventually start slowing up and lose time. This was very serious as it would delay every train behind us. It happened to me on many occasions, and it didn't matter what skills I adopted, I just could not maintain steam pressure. It was not always the fireman's fault. It could be the poor quality of the coal we were using. The best coal was claimed by the manufacturing industries. Then also there was the fact that all the engines were working flat out and stopping for service only on rare occasions. It meant that the firebox was gradually filling up with clinker and ash, as was the smoke box, thus preventing a very hot, clean fire. Every engine had its own peculiarities. They were fired in different ways, and one needed experience and skill to know how each engine was to be handled. It was a very difficult situation to be in, but it could all be made easier or better by the driver's help, or worse by his hindrance. There were good and bad drivers, and I was fortunate in having a good one. My first driver was Bert Brown from Reading, who had previously been a firing instructor. So my education was continuing. We built up a very good rapport between us, and we were a good team. We were together one day on a train running from Newbury to Bristol. We had no idea what we had on as a load, but we had 50 wagons, which were very heavy. Fortunately, we had a very good engine, which had been cleaned and serviced at Didcot sheds. It was a very hard drag up Enbourne out of Newbury, and it became quite a struggle, but we made it, and soon started bowling along through Kintbury and Hungerford. Then it was a very, very hard slog uphill to Savernake. This section was full of ups and downs and had many curves. Part of the fireman's duty, apart from firing, was to assist the driver at all times. This meant that when the signals were on the fireman's side of the line, he would look out of the cab and give the driver the information as to whether the line was clear or not. After a long time of instruction and experience, it became general knowledge for the fireman to know exactly where he was to watch for the signal at just the right time. This made for good teamwork and respect from the driver. We left Savernake and were now trundling downhill towards a junction at Putney. The engine was just coasting along, being pushed by the weight of the train. It meant very careful control by the driver, keeping the train under his command and not letting it get away from him. I had given Bert the green light and instructed him that the road was clear, and so we carried on. But as we passed through a small countryside station, the signal man was hanging out of the box, waving a red light. This meant immediate action, and Bert and I sprang together as a team. He had to shut down the engine steam power and was applying the brake. I was busy winding on the handbrake as hard as I could, but because of the sheer weight, we made no progress stopping our train. The wheels were locked, and as we slid along, sparks were flying everywhere. We were not going to stop. Unfortunately for us, the previous signalman had phoned in advance, and the signalman we were approaching had switched us off the main line into a side-in that had a sand trap. It was a very frightening experience. Bert's calm, efficient control, I felt quite safe. We eventually hit the sand trap and ground to a very abrupt halt that threw both of us into a heap. I received some nasty burns, but thanks to Bert, who had cleaned me up and dressed my burns, I was not too bad, and I didn't have to lose any work time. We still had no idea what we were carrying, but judging by the weight and the fact we were heading for Bristol docks, we speculated how lucky we had been not to have been blown to bits. I enjoyed my time with Bert, but one day he announced he was leaving Newbury as he'd been promoted to a higher rank at Reading Centre of Operations. My next driver was a gentleman from Didcot called Arthur Blake. That was the perfect description of him. He was a lovely, gentle man. He was only about 4'6" in height and very small in stature, more suited as a jockey. I never knew what his past history was, but he did have a great interest in the sport and was actually carrying on with a lady from Raunton Racing Stable near Swindon. Though he was small, he was very firm and forthright. Nobody ever dared to take the mickey out of him. They usually got more than they expected. He handled any engine of any size with full control and expertise. I became very attached to him and looked forward to being on duty with him. The railways were becoming very busy by now, and there must have been dozens of trains through Newbury every day. It was quite noticeable that a lot of the goods trains were terminating at the marshalling ford that had been created at Newbury Racecourse. It was all very hush-hush, and we had no idea what was going on. We knew that the racecourse had been disbanded as part of the wartime austerity program. Eventually, a lot of flatbed wagon trains started arriving, with loads of railway line for a new track. Then we were told what was happening, because eventually we would be involved. The course was being transformed into a huge marshalling and storage ford. There was everything stacked out there that any US Army force could possibly need, from a safety pin to a tank. There was also 21 miles of railway track laid out. That meant that when we were on marshalling duty, we became involved with all this massive movement of equipment. In the meantime, Arthur and I carried on with our mainline duties and shared many exciting moments on varied train loads. One day we were working a train from Newbury to Southampton via the branch line that existed from Newbury to Berkeley, and then on to Whitchurch, and eventually through to Winchester. As we approached Berkeley, the signals were against us, and we had to eventually stop, which we did. Well, we waited and waited and waited, and Arthur had blown the engine whistle several times to remind the signalman that we were there, but there was no response. Then it became the fireman's duty to walk forward to the box and find out why the delay. I must have walked at least half a mile before reaching the signal box, and having done so realized that there was absolutely no sign of life anywhere. I eventually climbed up the steps to the box and found the signal woman very sound asleep. She, like us, had been very hard at work for long hours and had finally succumbed to her tiredness. She was very embarrassed at being found out, but we made no big deal of it. In fact, as Arthur brought the train towards me, he stopped at the box and told her that he would be reporting that we had suffered from a loss of steam due to a bad coal, and that is why we stopped. That was the kind of gentleman Arthur was. He had saved the lady from any further inquiries and disgrace. If there was one failing that Arthur had, it was his obsession with gambling on the horse races. There were one or two courses still open, and it was practically guaranteed that he'd have a bet on one or all of the races for that day. As soon as we signed on duty, if there was a lull before our train arrived, he would be busy studying a race form. He would use several permutations on 3 or 4 races to try and cover the money he had laid on. At one stage, he would back all horses that had red in its name, i.e. Red Robin, Red Flag, Red Rose, etc. But it was quite usual that on the day he did either bet the other would win. Then he used to get really mad. He used to take his cap, throw it to the floor, and swear he'd never bet again. But sure enough, next day he'd be back studying the paper again. Whenever we were stopped in a side-in for any great length of time, it would be a great chance to service our engine. The coal tender on the engine would be full from the front to the back with up to 6 tons of coal. Well, all the firing was done from the front, so that eventually it became harder to reach the coal. It was then, while the engine stood in the siding, that the fireman would climb into the tender and shovel a large quantity of coal forward. That's what I would be doing while Arthur was on the ground, oiling all of the bearings, etc. But being so short, it became difficult for him to clamber over the top of the engine to do the oiling. So, having satisfied myself that I had enough coal forward, I would take over for Arthur. We had a good working partnership, but one day I was to lose Arthur as well. He was very arthritic by then and was posted to lighter duties at Didcot Shed. Unfortunately, he ended his life by drowning in a reservoir. The next driver I had was a different kettle of fish altogether. He was Sid Bassett from Plymouth Engine Shed. He was a very senior hand at driving and quite Victorian in his method of training his firemen. He stood very firm and had no time for failures. Woe betide to me if I did anything wrong. But once again, thanks to my home training, I was used to such severe discipline and was able to do what I was told without quibbling. I was now considered to be a top-link fireman, and with Sid's expertise, we were now given more sophisticated trains with the far bigger engines, such as Castles, Kings, and the Halls and Saint classes. Our trains were elite passenger milk trains and express goods. We also found ourselves working troop trains, and after Dunkirk, ambulance trains. It was all a wonderful experience, but very hard work. We would pick up a passenger train from Reading to Plymouth, and at the end of the day we had burnt nearly 9 tons of coal. Having arrived at Plymouth, we were relieved, and then had to wait for a train home. Sometimes it would be a passenger train and we could settle down to a nice sleep, but it could also be a goods train, and we would have a bumpy ride home in the guard van or caboose. There was a time when Sid and I worked a train back to Paddington, and then had to wait for a ride home. We settled down once again and soon fell asleep. I awoke once and saw that it was pouring down rain, so settled back to sleep again. We were awakened by a coach cleaner and then found out that it hadn't been raining after all. We had been through a coach wash, much like a car wash. We were stranded at Windsor, and it took hours for us to get back home to Newbury. We never told a soul, as we didn't want to end up being the brunt of a joke. Sid was a big, portly man and carried himself with an air of superiority. I used to feel quite proud walking along the platforms with him. I was also very pleased with the knowledge that I could work with any driver, thanks to Sid's training. Then the day came that Sid was posted back to Plymouth on domestic grounds. His wife was elderly and was finding it difficult to cope on her own. It was a sad loss for me. I enjoyed his company very much. Now I was in for a totally new experience. I was now fireman to Bill Fiddler. He was a very jovial man and a natural comedian. His wit and banter was an ever-surprising gift that rose to the surface in some of the most tiresome and dangerous situations. I didn't know it at the time, but Bill had asked for me to be his mate, as we were to be a specialized team that was to be seconded to the U.S. Army Transportation Corps based at the racecourse. This is how I first came into contact with U.S. forces, and I was in for an exciting new experience. Our immediate supervisor was Captain Lysak, who was a very bullish-looking man, but who had a heart of gold. We had regular meetings with him during our role in assisting what was to become a crucial phase of the war. Newbury was now becoming the most important area in the support campaign. All the surrounding areas of Newbury were totally covered by U.S. troops. Bucklebury Common, from Bradfield to Cold Ash, Snellsmore Common from Welford to Charlesworth to Donington, Hungerford Common to Savernake, including the Forest, and all the way from Winchester to Southampton. Literally thousands of men. This was to be the invasion force, and we had every item they would need for such an eventuality, all stacked up over the course. There were items that I had never seen before, such as paraffin gas lamps, water bottles fitted with canvas holders on a belt, food trays with sections for each ingredient, blankets, tents, gas capes, wonderful high-leg boots with special soles and heels, which we later learned were for parachutists, rubber overboots with metal fasteners across the top, and tons of food we had never heard of before. It was amazing to see that all the foods for serving troops were in khaki-colored tins, such as evaporated milk and spam, etc. We later learned that when disposed of, they wouldn't reflect light from any source. We were like two children running around in Aladdin's cave. Anyway, what we were supposed to be doing was to ensure that the wagons they would load into were in good condition and were not overloaded. And when we were satisfied, the wagons were assembled into trains of 50 or 60 wagons. The goods arriving from the States were packed in bales or crates and then packed into huge containers. There were reasons for all these large packing containers too. It would not be long before two of these containers, side by side, would become living quarters and huts for officers. The crates were converted into armchairs and the bale material used for drapes, etc. It was truly amazing, and soon we had quite a little village on site.